Thank you. It's a distinct pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to Chris Keith for the invitation and to St. Mary's for having such a marvelous venue. It's really delightful. Chris mentioned yesterday that Pope Benedict had been here before. I'm going to return to Jerusalem just as St. Francis is arriving. So I'm going to talk basically about this subject of Hasatan or Satan. And I phrase it or pronounce it that way for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it's not anglicized. And also, normally in the past, as I discussed the figure of Hasatan and the rise of Hasatan, sort of the long literary history, I pronounced it that way because if I said Satan, that conjures up in the minds of all students a particular set of values. And so there are a number of reasons for my doing that, but I'll do it here, mostly because that's the best way to pronounce it in Hebrew as well. In any case, I'll be using ancient Near Eastern literature and the biblical literature as well, basically attempting to set in broader context the figure of Hasatan and the development of Hasatan in some respects as well. So we'll begin. The Epic of Gilgamesh, I often begin here for obvious reasons. That is to say, Genesis 3 often figures rather prominently in discussions of the devil and in discussions of Satan. One of the things that I often find it very useful to mention in the broader context, therefore, is the fact that within Genesis 3, one of the things that's true is that the Nahash actually functions in a way that's very similar to the function of the snake within the Epic of Gilgamesh. You'll remember with me that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have Gilgamesh in pursuit of immortality. He's able to talk to Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim tells him that the way that he himself acquired immortality isn't a viable option at this point. So it's not a viable option at all. And so the only mechanism, the only means of achieving immortality is by finding this plant in the depths of the ocean. And Gilgamesh goes in search of it, finds it, pulls the plant, plucks it as it were, swims to the surface, is about to partake of the plant that will give him immortality, and then a snake actually seizes it. And this is analogous to the motif that we have present within Genesis, of course, as well. As we move on, therefore, to texts that actually do refer to Hasatan or Satan, they basically group into two different categories in terms of substantival usage. There's verbal usage as well, but I'm going to focus on substantival usage. Basically, we have references in Job and Zechariah, Chronicles, and arguably Numbers to some sort of a celestial figure. That is to say, Hasatan is a member of some sort of divine council or court or group within the heavens. We also have references within the Hebrew Bible to Satan as a human figure or human thing. So, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 29 and verse 4, there's a discussion among the Philistines about whether or not David the mercenary, who's been fighting with them, is actually someone that's good to use on a day in battle when they'll be engaging the armies of Saul. Now I'd like to move for a few minutes, and basically I'm hopefully constructing a case using biblical materials, the context of the biblical materials, and then at times ancient Near Eastern material, to discuss basically the early history of Hasatan, the celestial figure. So now we're going to move into that, and I realize that obviously much, maybe all, I suppose, of the biblical materials are well known, but for rhetorical purposes, I will summarize certain aspects of them. In any case, you'll remember the narrative very well in Job 1 and 2. We have Yahweh present. Yahweh is now the head of the pantheon according to this text. You'll remember with me Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, when Elyon arguably is the head of the pantheon. Yahweh is among the Bnei HaElohim. In this case, it's clear that Yahweh's received a promotion, as it were. He's the head of the pantheon, and the Bnei HaElohim come to him. It's a meeting of the divine council. Hasatan is among them. There's some discussion about whether he's actually a separate sort of figure, not one of the B'nai HaElohim, a term that, of course, literally means the sons of the gods, or whether there's discussion about whether Hasatan is a separate figure or, in fact, one of the B'nai HaElohim, and grammatically, both are possible scenarios. And then, of course, the family from the land of Uz. You remember basically the way it's discussed. We're told that Yahweh's there, the B'nai HaElohim come. It's a meeting of the divine council. Hasatan is there. Yahweh basically says to Hasatan, what is it that you've been doing? There's a play on words and the name Satan within this text as well. And then Yahweh basically says, have you seen Job? And Job is said to be Tam Vayishar. In other words, sort of upright and righteous, something along those lines. And then Hasatan basically indicates that he's seen him. And then Hasatan says, look, I think that it's true that he seems to be Tam Vayishar, but I'm not sure that his motives are pure. So basically Hasatan argues that there should be a test to determine whether or not Job, for example, this figure that Yahweh has proposed as Tam Vayishar, through and through, there should be a test to determine whether or not this is true disinterested piety. And, of course, we know about the test. Round 1, property is at stake, but not health. Round 2, we actually have health involved as well. I always remind students, because this is one of the things that they often don't recall about the text, is that the text graphically describes just how bad the health concerns were for Job. He takes a potsherd, something many of us have handled tens of thousands of, and he takes one of those and scrapes it on the boils of his body. So I knew that you wished for that visual image. Now let's continue on, but the writer gives it to us for a reason. Potsherds were part of antiquity. They were everywhere on ancient sites. And we see just how graphic, how brutal this is to lose property, including children, which would in some respects be considered property, and then also to lose health. Peggy Day has said this about Job and Hasatan. What the Satan does, or what the Satan does, is in fact challenging God's blueprint for divine human relations. In other words, the Satan is questioning the validity of a moral order in which the pious unfailingly prosper. The test of true righteousness would be to worship without the promise of reward. I'm going to differ with Peggy Day slightly with regard to this, but remember this quotation, and we'll bring it up again as well. Elaine Pagels said this: as he first appears in the Hebrew Bible, Satan is not necessarily evil, much less opposed to God. I think that's basically the case indeed. On the contrary, he appears to be, in the book of Numbers and in Job, as one of God's obedient servants, a messenger or angel, a word that translated the Hebrew term for messenger, malach, into Greek, angelos. In Hebrew, the angels were often called the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, and were envisioned as the hierarchical rank of a great army or the staff of a royal court. Most everybody in Hebrew Bible would embrace the first half of this statement and then differ strongly with the second half. That is to say, although there's a strong interpretive tradition within Second Temple Judaism that the B'nai HaElohim were angels, we see it in the LXX, of course we see it in Enoch. The fact of the matter is that that's not the meaning of that term in its ancient Near Eastern context. We actually have B'nai HaElohim, or the cognate, the direct semantic and even linguistic cognate, attested in languages such as Phoenician, Aramaic, Ugaritic, and Akkadian as well. And that term means literally the sons of the gods, that is to say, the divine children. So this isn't some way of referring to a non-divine celestial member, which is the way that we often use the term. It's actually a way of referring, generally speaking, to a divinity, a member of the divine council, literally the sons, the children of the gods. And that's the way that it's used within the ancient Near East, and I think that's the way that it's used in the Hebrew Bible. Of course, in passing, I'll simply refer to the fact that we do have Mesopotamian precursors to this, very important ones. Lulubel Nemeki is one of them. Basically, what I'm suggesting here, and we're going to do more of this in just a moment with regard to Zechariah, is this. Hasatan, and I want to contrast my belief, my construct of the evidence with that of Peggy Day's. Basically, I don't think that Hasatan is challenging the divine-human relationship or the blueprint. Basically, Hasatan is attempting to discern, as a prosecutor might very well do, the motives, and that's it. Both Hasatan and Yahweh equally culpable in this entire scenario, but both Hasatan and Yahweh presuppose that Job is Tam Vayashar. I think that's true. The question is whether or not there's some sort of motive that's not pure in this. And I would argue that basically Hasatan is attempting to discern here if there is in fact disinterested piety in the world, or rather if people are simply being pious because of the benefits that they receive. And I think that I would also wish to say, rather strongly I suppose, that Hasatan is functioning in a very laudable way here. That is to say, he's attempting to discern if there is disinterested piety. I think that this is something which is rather interesting, philosophically, to determine, and quite important, and not, of course, an evil pursuit at all. So I would say again here, in this context, if we were to ask ourselves, what about this function of Hasatan? Is he good or bad? And I would say basically in Job, he's functioning in a positive manner. He's attempting to discern if there's disinterested piety. And I think the answer to that is yes, there is disinterested piety. But that's the point. In other words, that's the point, and it's actually a pretty good point. In other words, Hasatan, when he begins his literary history, is actually functioning in a difficult way. He's a prosecuting attorney. Now, I suppose that all of us might say, well, prosecuting attorneys aren't the sort of people I wish to spend a great deal of time with. I suppose we could probably discuss that. There might be some former lawyers or current lawyers among us today. In any case, I think, yes, we could concede the point that Hasatan is a difficult figure, and not the sort of person that we might want to go to the pub with and drink a few rounds. But he's fulfilling a pretty valuable function in Job. He's trying to discern whether or not there's disinterested piety, and that, I think, is a positive function. And he gets his answer. Yahweh was right. And also in Zechariah, Hasatan is basically saying the high priest isn't pure enough as he is. Yahweh concedes the point and then basically purifies him. And I would say here in Zechariah, this too is a positive function. So when Hasatan begins his literary history, and for me it's solely a literary history, I think that it's a positive function indeed. The main point that I want to make, though, and this is the final sentence or two, is this. Hasatan, at the time of his early history, is actually a figure that's doing very good things. And so I differ with, graciously, I hope, but also, I hope fairly convincingly, with some who've written previously about Hasatan's early history. I would suggest basically that he's a very positive figure. He's attempting to discern in Job the presence or absence of disinterested piety, and I think we would all agree that this is a good thing. And in the Zechariah narrative, he wants to ensure the fact that the high priest of this second temple that's about to begin services is in fact someone who's capable of that. With Chronicles, we see basically a pejoration of the function of Satan, and we see that, of course, continue during the later Second Temple literature. Thank you very much.
Let's take one or two questions before
I often try to emphasize the fact that he's not a bad guy when things begin. And often in various contexts, I have to state that in fairly strong terms, and I'm still shot with the arrows at times. the poison arrows that come, not from you, but from classes, student classes at times. Because I basically want to say that at the very beginning, he's not the sort of person I would want to spend a great deal of time with, because he's the sort of fellow who seems to be able to see things too clearly. He's able to ascertain whether or not there really is disinterested piety. And of course, this can be a difficult process, as Job would certainly attest. So, yeah, so he's a complex figure. What I would mostly say is that the attempt to discern whether or not there really is disinterested piety, it's a laudable attempt. The attempt to make sure that the high priest is really pure is a laudable thing. Now, some people may say, and have said to me at times, look, I think you're giving him too much of a benefit of the doubt. I think that he had ulterior motives in the entire thing. In other words, I don't really think that he wanted Joshua to be the high priest, and I don't really think that he wanted Job to come out, with flying colors. Okay, maybe not, but I think so. But what I would want to say is that my reading is at least a reasonable reading, and I would also want to say that many people, in discussing Hasatan's early history, have read his early history through the lens of his later history, and I think methodologically that's problematic for me.
Yeah, you use a lot of language of he.
It's a masculine word.
I don't mean the genitive, I mean the singular.
Yeah, good point.
Do you think that is a consistent identity, that this is one individual?
Nope.
So you use that language a lot.
Yep. Yeah, great question. I'm really glad you asked it. Right. I use the third person, common singular masculine, because the text uses that. Of course, as all of you know, and you as well. With regard to whether or not this is a single figure, a singular figure, I suspect that it's a title. And so I would be disinclined to suggest that it's a particular person. And I would simply, or persona, I think it's a title. And arguably, from my perspective, at the very beginning, he's a member of the B'nai HaElohim, and this is a function. And it could be that at one point, Ben number 1 functions as Hasatan, and later Ben number 2 does, or something such as this. So it's not, for me, it's not a particular figure, even though we know where the tradition eventually goes, namely to consider this to be a single figure. But I would argue that that's probably not the beginning point, but it's absolutely impossible to know with certainty whether or not the writer of Job and Zechariah and Chronicles all had the very same figure in mind, or simply the title. So, great question. I'm really glad you asked it.
Maybe that can, just to tease that out a little bit, it's more of a role function, not so much as a name.
Yes.
I wonder if that allows a little bit more flexibility in terms of personality types, because you're adding a lot of he is a good person, has your best interest in mind. Well, maybe the role is prosecutorial.
Yep.
But in terms of personality,
Absolutely. That's right. And I would even state that it's entirely possible that there were two, if we were to posit sort of proto-Satan, as it were, proto-Hasatan, there could be two separate streams, or even more separate streams, and we may just be seeing in Job and Zechariah one of those streams, and in Chronicles a different of those streams, and that's entirely possible as well. In other words, it may be possible, it may be necessary to say that these are two separate streams. We do happen to see one earlier, Job and Zechariah, and one a little bit later, Chronicles coming later in terms of the writing of that piece of literature. But it may be that they were, in terms of chronology, present in sort of the proto-Hasatan history from the very beginning. And of course, what we ultimately know is where the tradition goes, which is absolutely fascinating. And I'm looking forward to hearing all of you discuss those sorts of things in the coming days.